Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to History Inscribed, Paper Assets and the Stories Behind Them. Now, today should be a fun video. We're going to be talking about collecting the Declaration signers. Specifically, we're referring to the Declaration of Independence, the men who signed this document, and their autographs and associated paperwork that bears their name. Now, why is this a collecting set or a market of its own? Well, there are a few reasons, of course. Why collect the Declaration signers? Well, number one, this was a very important document. Obviously, it was considered now the foundation of the founding document that would lead to a superpower nation. So just for that reason alone, it's considered important. But also, it kind of sits at that right intersection of historical paper, where paper was still considered a luxury good. It's still rare to have paper that survived from the 1700s somewhat, definitely compared to the later half of the 1800s and 1900s, where paper survival rates are much higher. You might say it's difficult but not impossible to collect all 56 signers. It is essentially impossible for the average person, but for archivists, museums, serious collectors, they could actually collect all 56. It is possible. So that's another reason. And really, it's just interesting because a lot of these men thought they were signing their own death warrant. So from that perspective, it's just an interesting story. No matter how much you study it, you just keep coming back to the fact that these men believed so much in either what they were doing, or they had gone so far they couldn't really turn back. And even one of the signers, Benjamin Rush, he said as they were signing their names, they felt they were signing their own death warrant. And many of them did suffer as a result of signing this. So it's just a foundational document. What's interesting is it wasn't immediately considered what it is today. It actually fell into obscurity for about 20, 30, 40 years, something like that. It really wasn't until the early 1800s, when a lot of these men were dying off, that the Declaration became a legendary document. And that's kind of true with a lot of collectibles, right? In recent history, we don't see it as a legendary thing, but after a few decades passes with certain things, we look back on them and say, wow, that is something for the ages. And that's what happened here. In the early 1800s, they started writing books on the men who signed this. People started to collect their cut signatures and so forth, and it became a thing of its own, almost a cliche in autograph collecting to try to collect this set. It's kind of the quintessential autograph collecting set, or premier autograph collecting set. Okay, let's talk for a minute about who didn't sign before we get into some of these men who did sign it. So if you're going after signers of the Declaration, you will not be going after Washington. That is the big one. Oops. Oh, yeah. Any of the Army generals that were with Washington, they were not in the convention. They were not in Congress in July 1776. They were with the Army, of course, people like Charles Lee, John Sullivan, Nathaniel Greene, any of Horatio Gates, any of these major Army generals. They're not going to be included in this. And also some of the younger founders like Hamilton, Burr, Madison, Monroe. Hamilton and Monroe were with the Army. Of course, these were the next generation of founders who were more involved with the Constitution and the early federal government. They were a little bit too young to be involved with the Declaration. And then there were some more major figures who simply either weren't there or opposed the Declaration or just missed the signing. So, like Livingston got recalled to his home state. He missed the signing. Patrick Henry was not involved. George Mason was not involved. They were in their home states. And then you had dissenters like John Dickinson, who, if you've seen John Adams, he's the main antagonist to John Adams during this period. So he did not want to separate from Britain. So, and in fact, about 1/5 of the men in Congress did not sign the Declaration for that reason. They did not support independence. Okay, so who did sign this document? Let's talk about that for a moment. There were, I don't think that's going to show up very well. "56 men who did sign." Okay, and they were the colonial elite. This is important to understand. The American Revolution was not a true bottom-up revolution in the style of like the French Revolution. It was very much a middle-up revolution. It was the colonial elite overthrowing their bosses in Britain, and the people, the residents, the average farmers and mechanics and so forth, they had to choose a side basically. And of course, there were a lot of enslaved people too who had no say. So when we talk about the 56 signers, we're really talking about the best of the best, the wealthiest men in the colonies. They were all white. They were all men, of course. They were almost all Protestant or Protestant leaning, with the exception of one. There was one Catholic. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is how he signed, from Maryland, and he was basically allowed because he was extremely wealthy, despite being a Catholic. And one of where they were egalitarian, they were just about evenly split between North and South. So that is one area where the Continental Congress was actually quite egalitarian. You could argue that a little bit depending on like how you consider Delaware and a few of those border states, but it was pretty evenly split between North and South. Now, the figure that I found shocking is how many were associated with slavery. I looked this up, and it says 41 out of 56 owned slaves at some point. I looked up some arguments to that, and maybe that might be a little high. I'm not sure, but it's definitely more than I thought. I would have thought maybe 20 or 30. It appears to be the majority. So that was a little bit interesting and something I didn't expect. But for the reasons we talked about, because this is such a important document, foundational document, it's been in autograph collecting for a long time. A lot of people do collect these, and I think people will into the future as well. So what are some of the different ways that you could go about collecting this market? There are a couple ways, and I'll list them basically from least prestigious, generally, least expensive, generally, to most prestigious and most expensive. Of course, these are unique items, so you can't give a hard and fast rule. This is generally. First would be a cut signature. A cut signature is basically when autograph collecting got started. They would take the signature at the bottom of a letter or a manuscript or a document of some kind. They would clip it out and just save the signature. For whatever reason, that's what they went after. As things evolved, we wanted to see more of the context around it. So a cut signature is kind of bottom of the barrel. But for a document of this caliber, a cut signature is, better than the average cut signature. But for the most part, cut signatures are kind of to be avoided nowadays. They lack the context and the interest and the mystique of a whole document or even a larger scrap of paper that has survived. However, cut signatures are somewhat common for the declaration signers. If you do look into cut signatures in this market, it's important that they be authenticated because it's much easier to fake a cut signature than it is to fake an entire document. And companies like PSA, Beckett, James Spence, they will encapsulate and certify cut signatures. So that would be one way to acquire these. Another would be through colonial currency. There are 3 of the signers who were tasked with signing colonial currency. And this was because when the colonies issued their own money, they did it by state, by colony. And issuing paper money was a big deal. It was one of the reasons for the revolution. Britain tightly controlled the money supply. The merchants and just the average people in the colonies always had trouble getting their hands on hard currency, gold and silver, and they weren't allowed to mint their own. So to keep the counterfeiting down during the war, it was a major issue because if they couldn't control their money supply, they might as well have been colonies and not a separate country. They implemented many different anti-counterfeiting measures. And one of those was to have prominent men from the colonies actually signing these by hand. And if you look at some of these bills that have survived, they have 3 to 5 signatures on them. And they weren't printed on a plate and engraved and stamped like our money is today. They were actually signed by hand. So there were 3 of these men who were among the men who signed currency. And that makes their signature a lot more prevalent than some of the others. And therefore, that is another way you can acquire some of these names. In fact, I think it was Francis Hopkinson from New Jersey who wrote a letter complaining how much time he was wasting signing these bills night after night by candlelight, in a cramped attic or something like that, when he could have been doing other things. So just know that that is an option, and it lets you get into the colonial currency market as well as the declaration signer market. Now, a step up from that would be a document signed, and this is basically any kind of form letter, unrelated document to what we're talking about, the declaration, but they signed it. And it could happen earlier in life, could happen later in life, could be like a lot of these are land transactions, deeds, indentures, receipts, things like that. But these are considered legitimate for collecting purposes if they sign their name, and it doesn't have to be related to the declaration. Then there's also an autographed letter signed, and these are at the kind of the top of the totem pole here. This is where they write a letter in their own hand, expressing their own thoughts and feelings, and sign it. So, a few different ways to collect these signatures. Okay, what I want to do next is just go over some of these names to help give you a starting point to know if you want to be involved in this market or not, and if you do, maybe which names to start with, because 56 can be a little overwhelming. Now, if you do want to learn about all 56, which I'm not going to cover all 56 here, there is another YouTube video I found that's quite good by another independent creator, and I'll link to that. I think it's called Bay State History. He did a good video on all 56, and it's about an hour long. So if you're interested in that, check that out as well. I'm not going to cover all 56. What I'm going to do is divide these into different tranches just to give you some different price points and let you think about which ones you might want to go after, if you do want to go after them. So first you should know that there are essentially two impossible signatures. They're just very, very pricey. They don't come up very much, and when they do come up, it's going to be serious wealthy investors who acquire them. And these are Button Gwinnett, from Georgia, and Lynch, Thomas Lynch Jr. from South Carolina. Why are they the most expensive? It's simply because they died very young. They died shortly after signing the Declaration. Button Gwinnett was killed in a duel with Lachlan McIntosh, and that's a whole story worthy of a video of its own. Perhaps I'll cover someday. But, you know, in the South, the Revolutionary War, they were fighting amongst themselves too, not just the British. And so Button Gwinnett was kind of with the Whig faction, and he sparred with this more conservative colonial elite faction led by McIntosh, and it culminated in a duel. They both shot each other, and Gwinnett died. Thomas Lynch Jr., he died at sea not long after, I think in 1779. So the price of these is, for Lynch, it's like $10K upward. For a Button Gwinnett, there are only about 50 signatures in existence, so he's about $100K. It can run up to, I think, even $800K. So they're really not obtainable for the average person. Okay, and then you also have some very expensive signatures. And this is mostly just due to rarity. For whatever reason, not a lot of their material survived. This would be like John Morton. Let's see. Taylor, Stockton, Hopkins. And Thomas Hayward Jr. These are some of the more expensive ones. And these are at price points, again, it varies based on what you're buying and condition and everything, but these would be around several thousand to upward to, let's just say 2K to like 15K. Okay, so that's, you have to be a serious collector to go after these. Now, Another tranche I would list are the most famous ones. And these are the men whose names are really recognizable, even to the average person who doesn't really know a lot about the Declaration or history. And of course, these would be like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, the Adams, both John Adams and Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. And I would throw in Richard Henry Lee. He proposed independence and was a member of the wealthy Virginia Lee family, of course. I would say these are like the top tier, most famous names. They're not necessarily the most expensive because a lot of these men signed lots of documents. The most affordable of these would be John Hancock because he was a governor for several terms in Massachusetts and he signed a lot of documents up in New England where paper tended to survive. So if you want to go after like the blue chip names, you know, these are probably run like 2 to 10K, but they could go up to like 100K. The range is like wider because of Jefferson mainly and Franklin. And some of these presidential papers, you know, could go much higher. But if you just want a basic kind of borderline boring paper signed by them, you're looking at still several $1,000s to even get into the market. Okay, let's move on to, and we'll maybe cover some the mid-tier signers. You may or may not recognize any of these names. That's why I'm doing this. It's good to kind of know what you don't know. James Wilson, Robert Morris, Caesar Rodney is a good mid-tier. George Wythe. And Elbridge Gerry, or Gary. Oliver Wolcott. Benjamin Rush. Josiah Bartlett. And let's throw in there Roger Sherman too. So these men, they don't have the name recognition of like that last tranche we talked about. But to anyone who's a little bit more advanced in history, they will know some of these. James Wilson was probably considered the best lawyer in the colonies. He was more influential in the Constitution, and he did sign the Declaration too. He sided with obviously the colonists, but kind of just barely. He has a bit of a mixed reputation, a negative reputation for being in it for himself for the most part, and he got very involved in land speculation later in life. And we'll talk about him in another video. Robert Morris, also known as one of the big financiers of the Revolution. Similar story to Wilson. He eventually wound up in debtor's prison for land speculation, and I think he died penniless or close to it. Caesar Rodney, he has a good story associated with him where he had cancer and rode from Delaware to cast the deciding vote for independence. He had to ride, I think, 80 miles through a storm. And so you may have seen the Delaware State Quarter. They put Caesar Rodney on that. George Wythe was a mentor to Thomas Jefferson. Also Withville, Virginia is named after him. And I think he also freed his slaves later in life, so that's notable. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts is best known for gerrymandering, where you divide up districts according to the results you want, voting districts. And so that's a big topic today. Anytime there's an election, we hear about gerrymandering. Oliver Wolcott was a major founder from Connecticut, and a very influential family from Connecticut. Benjamin Rush was a doctor, which kind of sets him apart. And he also founded an abolitionist society, I believe, one of the first in Pennsylvania. Josiah Bartlett, I include him mostly for the West Wing connection, because the main character in the West Wing was Jed Bartlett. He was supposed to be descended from Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire. And Roger Sherman, I believe he signed he signed all 3 or 4 of the major documents, the Articles, the Declaration, and the Constitution. Pretty influential there as well. So those would be like the mid-tiers. Oh yeah, and once again, we're talking in the thousands here, probably the low thousands and up, 2,000 or 3,000 starting price probably. Okay, I do want to go into probably what most people are interested in, and that would be the entry-level signers. So if you just want to get started, maybe you just want one, and you don't know where to start, these would be the best starters. Probably the easiest name to acquire is John Hart. John Hart is one of those men, I believe he's from New York, who signed a lot of colonial currency. So you can find a John Hart signed bill and get into this market. And these entry levels, we're probably talking about around 500 to 700, let's call it. Maybe you could get a better deal. I don't know, but this is a pretty good range to start with. About the cheapest you're going to find a declaration signer is around $500. So, it's possible for the average person if they save and make it a priority, of course. Some other names in the entry level would be Thomas McKean. Let's list the names first, and then we'll talk about them. William Ellery. Matthew Thornton. And then we can add George Clymer. Francis Hopkinson, as I said, a signer of colonial currency from New Jersey. Charles Carroll of Carrollton. That is the lone Catholic we talked about at the beginning. And we'll add George Walton from Georgia. Okay, so why are these the entry levels? Well, mostly what these men have in common is they lived well past the Declaration signing, and they were prominent in either business or politics to the point where they signed a lot of documents. So a lot of supply survives. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because any declaration signer is valuable and rare. The only way What that would change is if people lose total interest in the Declaration, which I don't think will happen. I think over time, maybe some of the traits of these men will be called into question. Maybe the document will not be revered as much as it was in the past, but I think it will still be historically significant. So let's just talk about a few of the entry-level signers, and then we'll wrap up. We mentioned John Hart was a signer of New Jersey colonial currency. So if you're looking for the easiest way to get into this market, start looking for certified and graded New Jersey colonial notes encapsulated by PMG. That's the biggest company that grades colonial currency. And you can find a John Hart signature. Thomas McKean was a Chief Justice and Governor of Pennsylvania, and as such, he signed a lot of Pennsylvania-related material, like land grants, legal documents, officers' commissions, etc. And so he will run under that $1,000 mark, where the average person can't access him. Let's see, we have William Ellery. So he was a Rhode Islander. He served as the customs official in Newport, and therefore he signed a lot of things like shipping manifests and just customs documents that you can find under $1,000. Matthew Thornton. He appears most commonly on New Hampshire legal deeds and various documents related to New Hampshire as a justice of the peace. So you can find his cut signatures or perhaps those New Hampshire documents. Robert Morris, I think I forgot to write him down. He's kind of a maybe because he is a higher tier founder. But because he generated so many land documents later in life, you might be able to find a Robert Morris for like the higher end of three figures, under 1,000. But a lot of his stuff will be over 1,000 as well. But he's worth mentioning for entry level if you want to reach for that. George Clymer was from Pennsylvania as well, and he signed a lot of financial papers, checks, anything related to revenue documents that have survived. Okay, Francis Hopkinson, we mentioned, he was from New Jersey, and he signed a lot of New Jersey colonial currency, and also he was a treasurer of loans for the for the colonies there. So he signed a lot of continental loan certificates as well. Charles Carroll, in addition to being the only Catholic, he was the longest lived member of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He lived all the way until 1832. And because he lived so long, he kind of lived into the era of the postal system and the modern banking system that was set up after the war. So he left behind a lot of signed papers as well. So that is a good one to check out. And finally, George Walton from Georgia. He was a governor and judge in Georgia, and therefore he signed a lot of court papers and legal documents. So you can also find him for under 1,000. Now, personally, if I had to choose, I would go after probably Francis Hopkinson. Francis Hopkinson is probably my favorite of the entry-level people because he was a little bit different than most of the signers. Most of the signers were merchants or lawyers or planters. Francis Hopkinson was one of the few creative types. He wrote songs and pamphlets, anti-British pamphlets and propaganda. He did paintings, and he was, some people say he was involved with the making of the first flag. I don't really know. It's debated. But he was one of the few creative types of the Declaration signers, so I think that's pretty interesting. And Charles Carroll's also an outlier, as I said, for being the lone Catholic and surviving the longest as well. But any of these have their own stories, and if you check them out, you might see which ones appeal to you, if any. I will say, though, this is not like going to buy some other collectibles where they're always available. If you decide I want a Matthew Thornton cut signature, it might not be available anywhere right now. These do come up regularly, but each individual signer might not be available all the time. So my point is, once you decide who you want to look at, you really need to set alerts, whether it's on eBay, whether it's finding the auction, setting alerts on auction sites, or just getting into contact with a dealer, asking, if you find one of these, will you call me first, that kind of thing, because some of these are available at all times, but not each individual one is available all the time. These are a little bit thin in the market space here. Okay. Well, I think that's going to do it. I hope this was a good 101 level introduction to the declaration signers, and hopefully this gave you some ideas about how to go about it, the various price points, and some of the names that you might be able to look into. Please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, History Inscribed. I'm going to be doing some more American Revolution stuff this summer because we are only 2 weeks away at the time of this video from the big 250th anniversary. So we're going to be looking at some Revolutionary era documents, some colonial currency, and telling some interesting stories coming up to coincide with that. So once again, thanks for watching History Inscribed. I'll see you on the next one.